Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2019. In this module we're going to continue looking at queries, and I really want to focus on two things: the query wizard and other query types. Before we do that, so far we have been specifying the country for our trips in two places. So we have had the country specified in the trip table record as well as having the trip country records. Now what I'm going to do is to remove the country from the trip record, and as part of that I'm going to show you how to remove a field from a record. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Design View for the trip table, and I'm going to select the country field. I'm going to right click my mouse and I'm going to select Delete Rows, and it's asking me, do I want to permanently delete? So I'm going to click Yes. And what it will also prompt me is that by deleting this country field, it requires the Esprit de Tour Trips of a Lifetime version 9 to delete one or more indexes. So I'm going to say yes to that as well. And you can see that that field is now gone. Let's now look at the query wizard. Now some of the comments related to this I'm going to base on the trip table. So in this trip table we have a code, a trip name, an activity level, description, duration days, price minimum, and price maximum. Now I'm going to close this trip table and I'm going to go into the query wizard. So it's really important to make sure that you do have the correct table selected in the navigation pane. So let's go to Create and Query Wizard. Now there are really four options for the type of query that you want to create. One of them is a simple query. There is a cross-tab query, there is a find duplicates query, and a find unmatched query. Now as we're looking at the query wizard and the query types, I'm going to explain some of the query types in this section, and some I'm just going to leave for you to have a little read about, so a little bit of extra reading for you if you want to do that. One other thing I'd like to point out here is if you do want to learn a little bit more about queries, you do have the little question mark in the top bar here which will take you to help on queries, and again that is something that I recommend you do go into and have a little look at. Now on this occasion I'm going to stick with the default and stick with a simple query and click on OK. Now it says which fields do you want, and by default it's selected the trip table, and that's because that's what I'm clicked on in the navigation pane. And what I want is the code from that, so I'm going to select code and click on the little chevron to move it into the selected fields area. I also want the trip name, but then I also want from the trip country table the country. So I'm essentially selecting fields from two different tables, and this query wizard makes it really easy to do that, as you can just switch to whichever table you want. I'm going to click Next. I then need to choose if I would like a detail or summary query. Now in this case let's do detail and click Next. And then what title do we want for our query? So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to rename this to QRY, just to keep the same naming convention. Trip, country, query. I then need to select one of these two options at the bottom. So it says, do you want to open the query or modify the query's design? Now I'm going to open the query and click on Finish. And we have the same result that we had earlier on. So it's basically looked at the data, and for every trip that has a country specified in the trip country table, it's basically given me a list of the countries that the trips go to. Once I've done that, I've got a query, and even though I created it with a wizard, it's just a simple query. So you can see here in the navigation pane, I now have my new query listed in the queries group. And if I was to go into the SQL for this, you would see it pretty much looks very similar to the queries that we created previously. So nothing is different. That's the point I'm trying to get across when you use the query wizard. It's just a different method for putting together that query. Now there's a lot that you can do with queries, and you can do a lot of things like summarizing and aggregation of data and so on. Now I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but I do want to introduce the possibilities in this course. So again, let's go up to Create and jump into that query wizard. We're going to choose Simple Query again. And from the trip table, we're going to take the code and the trip name. And we also want some information from the tour table. And I want the price adult information as well. Let's click on Next. And this time we're going to do a summary. And you can see here underneath I have some summary options. Now what Access does is it looks at the fields I've selected and it's determined which ones are suitable for summary or aggregation. So the most suitable one is price. So it offers me some calculations I could do. And again, if you're a user of Excel, then these will probably look reasonably familiar. I could choose to do a sum, an average, I could find the minimum price and also the maximum price. So I might think to myself, well, it could be quite interesting to check out what the minimum and max prices are and also what the average might be as well. So I might want to select all three of these. And another thing that I have down here is a little checkbox which says count the records in Tubble Tour. So basically if I was to select this option, it will tell me how many tours I have scheduled for each of my trips. So I'm going to select that one as well. I'm going to click on OK and let's click Next. And I'm going to call this one QRY Trip Tour Summary Query. I'm going to say Open and click Finish. And what you see there now is the average price over all the scheduled tours, the minimum, the maximum and the count. So hopefully that gives you more of an idea of how you can use this wizard for summary and aggregation. Now let me just remind you of something that we looked at briefly at the start of the course. If you look at the design of the trip table and specifically the code field, if you look down in the field properties in the general where it says field size, you can see that the 3-character code is indexed. And so it says yes and no duplicates. Whereas a trip name, if we highlight that, is not indexed. So if I'm adding data into my trip table, it would be impossible to add a trip with the same code because of that indexing and because duplicates are not allowed. Now, if I accidentally added a trip with the same name, but somehow the code was different, I could use one of the other options in the query wizard to detect duplicates. But I'm not going to show you that. I'm going to leave that as some extra work for you to do, some extra research if you like, after this course. So let's close down this trip table and just go back to Create and jump into that query wizard again. So the option I was talking about there was this one, Find Duplicates Query Wizard. Now the one below where it says Find Unmatched, this is also very useful because it will create a query that finds records in one table that have no related records in another table. So let's imagine I want to find the countries for which I currently have no trips. So I'm going to click on OK. So if I select Country, click on Next and select Trip Country, click on Next again. You're then going to look to see what the match is between the two, and in this case it is country. Let's click on Next. What fields do you want to see in the query results? Well, again, it is country. Click on Next, and I'm going to call this Query Country Not Visited. And I'm going to say Finish. And those are the countries for which I currently do not have a trip. So this can also be a really good way of checking that your database is set up correctly. Now when it comes to creating queries, if I click on Query Design, there are a number of different types of query as I mentioned before. Now apart from Select Query, which is what we're in now, and you can see that highlighted on the ribbon, we have a Make Table query whereby you select records and make them into a completely new table. We have an Append query, and this often is used when merging databases or tables, basically adding a data set to an existing table. Then we have a Crosstab query, which is used to aggregate data by two sets of values. So what I mean by that would be if you wanted to subtotal and average on a month-by-month basis, then you would use a crosstab query. And we also have a delete query, and you can use that if you need to do a bulk delete. Now for all of these query types, as I said, I recommend that you do take a look on the queries help page just to gain a better understanding of exactly what each of those do. So the final thing I want to demonstrate to you in this module is an update query. So let's pretend that we want to update all of the adult prices by $10, increase them all by $10. So I'm going to select the table tour and click Add. And that at the moment is the only one I need, so I'm going to close there. The query type is going to be update, so I'm going to click that. The field I want to change is going to be price adult, so let's drag that down to our grid. And we want to update it to price adult plus 10, because we're increasing it by $10. So we can check to make sure that this is going to work. Let's have a look at our tour prices to begin with. And we can see the top one there, price adult, is $11,360. Let's jump back to our query and let's briefly look at the SQL for this query. And we can see there, price adult plus 10. So let's run the query. And it says you're about to update 70 rows, so I'm going to say yes. And now if we go back to Toggle Tour, you can see there that price was $11,360 and it's now been updated to 370. So I can see that that query has actually worked. And it's worth noting, if we go back to that query, how easy it would be to put those prices back to how they were. So I could just replace the plus with a minus, run the query, select yes, and then our prices are back to how they were before. So hopefully that's given you a bit of insight as to how you can utilize that query wizard.